Welcome back, students. All right, we're going to be talking about monetary policy in the worst case scenario. And I'm going to be drawing two figures for you, figure 16.3 and figure 16.4. What are we responding to? A negative real shock. If you're chair of the Federal Reserve, please hope that you don't have too many of these during your tenure, because you truly are between a rock and a hard place. And in the previous video, when we were talking about how Fed acts during the best case scenario, you could undershoot and still face Charybdis, low growth, unemployment, or you could overshoot and then face Scylla, which is inflation, too much spending chasing too few goods. So the question is, what about the real shock? Well, you may not know if you need to fight Scylla or Charybdis. And so you may not even know what's going on. Because again, you're having these informational lags. You're having perhaps aggregate demand shocks accompanying these real shocks. You could have amplifiers and transmission mechanisms, making the situation even more complex. Okay, so but we're going to keep it simple, where the cause is a negative real shock, and what can the Fed do about it? Okay, so I'm going to set up the same scenario over here. So I'm going to explain the graph I just drew you here as I redraw it here. Okay. All right, so to make a little room, yes, we're putting our 3% way out here because we're going to be dealing with tough times, recession. So our old long run aggregate supply is at the cellular growth rate of 3%, and we're have an inflation rate of about 2%. Trying to make that as even on both sides as possible. Then we've got our aggregate demand curve that's associated with a spending growth rate of 5%. Okay. Now what happens? Well, we're going to get a negative real shock, maybe something like what we're experiencing now with the coronavirus pandemic. And our real growth rate goes from 3% to negative 3%, okay? And so we're going to move the long run aggregate supply curve to about the middle here. And call this the new long run aggregate supply. And that's associated with a negative 3% growth rate. Okay. And that's going to move the economy to point B. Okay. All right, so we're going to do the same thing over here. Aim for the middle. That's a little too curvy. Got to keep that long run aggregate supply a straight line. And so our new long run aggregate supply is at negative 3%. So same shock, two different responses, okay? All right, what about this short run aggregate supply curve? Where does it go? Well, it follows the long run aggregate supply curve, okay? So this short run aggregate supply curve was associated with an expected inflation rate of 2%. I need to finish drawing it over here too. And looks like we're running out of a little space on the screen here, so let's do short run aggregate supply associated with expected inflation rate of 2%. All right, I see that's a little cut off there, so let me move it out just a little bit in for you. Okay. All right, so here's our shocks. We're at point B here, and the short run aggregate supply curve is going to follow it, okay? Okay. Now, what is our inflation rate here? Well, our spending growth rate has not changed. Our aggregate demand curve has not shifted here, okay? And in this scenario, we are going to have to have 3 plus -3 plus the inflation rate has to equal 5. Okay, and so this must be 8% inflation. Now that's high. So the Fed may choose to fight inflation. So under figure 16.3, our goal is to fight inflation. Okay, the only way we can fight inflation is by slowing down the growth rate of the money supply. Okay, all right, so when we do this, we're going to shift it to we're basically going to have the Fed decrease the money supply. And so we're going to have Fed decrease money supply growth, okay? And that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. And that's going to bring us to point C, okay? And let's just say that that is a -5% growth rate, and -5 and then we would say this is 6%. Okay, so what that means is that our aggregate demand here, our spending growth rate must equal 1%. Okay, so this AD is associated with a 1% spending growth rate. Okay. All right, so we slow down spending, but what do we get? We get like 2 points off of inflation, and then we make our recession even worse. Okay? So if we fight inflation, we're going to get even more unemployment. Okay? All right, well, maybe you're thinking, let's fight unemployment. All right, well, what do we do in this case? Well, in this case, we would have to increase aggregate demand. Got to mark point A over here. So we're going to increase aggregate demand, and we're going to shift it out to the right. So in this case, Fed will increase the money supply growth rate, and we're out here. Okay, and so then we'll be at point C on this new short run aggregate supply curve here. And we might be able to get our growth rate up to -1. So we're still in a recession, not as mild of a recession, but we went from an 8% inflation rate. So remember, with the old spending growth rate of 5%, 8 plus -3 is 5%. Now, our spending growth rate is going to be higher. It's going to be associated with 12%. So our AD, not shown on here. Let me cut that part off there. let's say this AD right here is associated with a 12% spending growth rate. Okay, and what that means is that -1 plus 13% will equal that 12% spending growth rate. So this obviously isn't perfectly to scale, but you can see the idea is that you're going to get more inflation if you fight this unemployment. Okay. All right, so in summary, what are you going to do? Well, if you have a negative real shock, you could try to fight inflation, but you're going to make the recession worse, and you're going to make unemployment higher. You could try to fight unemployment, but most of that increase in money supply growth is just going to show up in terms of higher inflation. And when people can't get jobs, the last thing you want to do is raise the cost of living. So you might be saying, well, maybe it's just better for the Fed to do nothing. Okay, well, if it did nothing, would it just stay at point B? How long would it take for the real shock to correct itself and go back from the new long-run aggregate supply to the old long-run aggregate supply? Would a negative aggregate demand shock follow it? Because often these two are intertwined. And so then it ties in the question like, well, maybe it should not try to fight inflation or try to fight unemployment. Maybe it should just do what it can to keep aggregate demand fixed while it waits for this real shock to fix itself, or wait for other changes in the institutions of growth to shift that long-run aggregate supply curve back to the right. Now, that would be a case in which we might be doing something like nominal GDP targeting, because if you target the spending growth rate and you try to keep it at 5%, you're effectively targeting the nominal GDP growth rate. We'll talk later on in the chapter about how feasible it is to do something like that. But as you can see, this is a very tough scenario, and it's why it's called the worst case scenario, a negative real shock. Thank you.